It's pretty easy for NFL fans to debate the merits of offensive players, and there are so many stats you can cite in making your case. Who's the greatest quarterback of all time? Well, you've got touchdowns, passing yards, interceptions, completion percentage, you got passer rating, you got Super Bowl rings. Who's the greatest running back? You got rushing yards, touchdowns, yards per carry, yards per game. The greatest wide receiver? You've got receiving yards, you've got receiving touchdowns, you got yards per game, you got yards after the catch. And thanks to all these stats, which are so obviously associated with wins and losses, it's pretty hard for an offensive player to be underrated. That's not to say there are no offensive players who are underrated. They definitely exist. Phillip Rivers is an underrated quarterback. People kind of forget about him because he's an unassuming guy, and because the Chargers chose him over Drew Brees, and because the Chargers have been a dumpster fire for most of his tenure with the team. But believe it or not, Rivers is 8th all-time in both career passing yards and career passer rating, ahead of NFL legends like Joe Montana and John Elway. Rivers should be in the conversation for greatest quarterback of his generation, but he rarely is. Phillip Rivers is the exception to the rule though, and when it comes to offense, the vast majority of NFL greats, they get their due. That's not the case with defensive players, and that's because the greatness of defensive players is much harder to measure. Sure, there are defensive stats, you've got tackles, interceptions, sacks, forced fumbles, fumble recoveries, blase. But the value of a tackle or even a sack is way less tangible than the value of a touchdown. A touchdown is always the same. It gives your team 6 points. But a tackle, its value depends on a lot of other factors. Obviously, there are defensive superstars, guys who are household names, but their superstar status has a lot to do with what was expected of them coming into the league. J.J. Watt? He's a superstar, but people expected him to be great because he was the 11th overall draft pick in 2011. Patrick Willis, he's a superstar, but same situation. He was the 11th overall draft pick in 2007. The same can be said for the vast majority of the NFL's most famous defensive players. Lawrence Taylor, the number 2 pick in 81, Reggie White, number 4 in 84, Deion Sanders, number 5 in 89, Mean Joe Green, number 4 in 69. But let's narrow things down a bit. Let's focus just on superstar linebackers of the last 25 years. Junior Seau was the number 5 pick in 1990, Derrick Brooks was number 28 in 1995, Ray Lewis was number 26 in 1996, and Brian Urlacher was number 9 in 2000. In short, when it comes to defense, it's a lot easier to become a star if you start out a star. If you come from nowhere, you may have a long NFL career, but you're more likely to be underrated. And that brings us a guy who might just be the most underrated NFL linebacker of all time. A guy with more tackles than Derrick Brooks, more forced fumbles than Brian Urlacher, and more interceptions than Junior Seau, and almost as many sacks as Ray Lewis. A guy who at one point played in over 250 consecutive games and holds the NFL record for consecutive starts at linebacker. A guy who wasn't drafted at all, let alone in the late rounds, because he went to a Division III school. That guy's name? London Fletcher. Now obviously, London Fletcher isn't a nobody. Any NFL fan over the age of 30 probably remembers him. But London Fletcher is rarely mentioned in the same breath as guys like Ray Lewis and Brian Urlacher, despite the fact that he was one of the best linebackers in the NFL for a long time. The guy deserves more credit and fame than he's been given, and today, we're gonna give it to him. Fletcher was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and played high school football at Villa Angela St. Joseph. Upon graduation, after receiving 0 scholarship offers from a Division I program of any kind, Fletcher ended up enrolling at John Carroll University, a small Jesuit liberal arts university about 25 minutes from his high school. Fletcher ended up playing basketball and football for the Blue Streaks. However, he excelled in football. During his 4-year collegiate career, Fletcher was a 2-time first-team All-American. He recorded 386 tackles, 37 tackles for loss, 14 sacks, 3 interceptions, 2 touchdowns. During his senior year in 1997, Fletcher recorded a school record 202 tackles and was named Division III Linebacker of the Year. There was some interest in London Fletcher after he graduated from John Carroll. He attended the NFL Scouting Combine, where he ran a 4.38 in the 40. He also worked out for some teams privately, and some draft experts actually thought he might get picked in the '98 NFL Draft. But that didn't happen. At just 5'10", 245 pounds, Fletcher was small for an NFL linebacker, and in the end, he went undrafted. However, in April of 1998, he signed a 1-year, $158,000 contract as an undrafted free agent with the St. Louis Rams. The deal worked out amazingly for everybody involved. Fletcher had a decent rookie season. He appeared in all 16 games and got 1 start in place of the injured Eric Hill, recording 11 solo tackles and 12 combined. So the Rams brought him back in 1999, upping his salary to a whopping $265,000. This time, Fletcher straight up won the starting inside linebacker gig in training camp, then went on to finish second in the team in tackles, starting every single game as the Rams shocked the world by going 13-3 and winning the Super Bowl. Not a bad sophomore season. The Rams gave Fletcher another raise after that, bringing his salary all the way up to $478,000 in his third season. And once again, Fletcher got even better. In 2000, the little linebacker from John Carroll University led the defending Super Bowl champs with 133 combined tackles and was second on the team with 4 interceptions. After that, Fletcher finally got paid some real money. In 2001, his 4th year in the league, he signed a 1-year, $1.1 million deal. Then all he did was start all 16 games, lead the team with 116 tackles, while also adding 4 forced fumbles and 2 interceptions, all en route to another Super Bowl appearance. At this point, it was clear that London Fletcher was no fluke. He was the real deal. But the Rams, who didn't factor Fletcher into their long-term planning when they originally signed him as an undrafted free agent, could no longer afford his services. In March of 2002, London Fletcher signed a 5-year, $17.12 million contract with the Buffalo Bills, and he went on to earn every penny. Over the next 5 years in Buffalo, Fletcher recorded 725 combined tackles, 14.5 sacks, 5 forced fumbles, and 5 interceptions, all while starting every single game. After that, Fletcher signed a 5-year, $25 million contract with the Washington Redskins. And it was in Washington that Fletcher finally started getting some of the credit he deserved. In 2009, after 12 outstanding seasons in the National Football League, and now as one of the undisputed leaders in the Washington locker room, London Fletcher was finally named to the Pro Bowl. But only as a replacement for Jonathan Vilma, whose New Orleans Saints were playing in the Super Bowl. And when Fletcher made the Pro Bowl, people finally woke up. They were like, oh, hey, now that you mentioned it, London Fletcher is really freaking good and he should probably be in the Pro Bowl every year. That's how they said it. Sure enough, Fletcher made the Pro Bowl in each of the next 3 seasons, and deservedly so. In 2011, at the age of 36, and still having never missed a single game in his entire career, London Fletcher led the NFL with 166 combined tackles. By the time Fletcher hung up his cleats after the 2013 season, he'd established himself as one of the NFL's all-time great Ironmen. The dude played 16 seasons and never missed a single game. Not one.
Just hurry the up and retire with yeah, I'm a player, man.
Appreciate it, man.
Of those 256 consecutive games, 240 of them came as a starter, and 215 of those were consecutive. I mean, how good is that? Fletcher's 256 consecutive games played is 4th all-time among all players. His 215 consecutive games started is 6th among all players and 1st among linebackers. Fletcher's Ironman streak alone should have made him a household name. An NFL player who never missed a game? That's insane, especially from the linebacker position. But how does Fletcher stack up statistically against contemporaries like Ray Lewis, Brian Urlacher, Junior Seau, and Derek Brooks, all of whom, I should point out, are in the Pro Football Hall of Fame? Well, the answer to that is he stacks up pretty freaking well. London Fletcher was never quite as dominant in his prime as those other guys, but his career numbers compare very favorably. Let's start with combined tackles. Fletcher finished his career with 2,031 combined tackles in 256 games, which works out to 7.93 per game. Ray Lewis had 2,055 combined tackles in 228 games, or 9.03 per game. Urlacher had 1,345 combined tackles in 182 games, or 7.39 per game. Seau had 1,846 combined tackles in 268 games, or 6.88 per game. And Brooks had 1,710 combined tackles in 224 games, or 7.63 per game. But what about solo tackles? Fletcher finished his career with 1,380, which is 5.39 per game. Ray Lewis had 1,562, 6.85 per game. Urlacher had 1,040, 5.72 per game. Seau had 1,522, 5.68 per game. And Brooks had 1,297, or 5.79 per game. Fletcher is not far off the Hall of Fame pace of solo tackles either. But what about the other stuff, like interceptions, sacks, and forced fumbles? London Fletcher finished his career with 23 interceptions, 19 forced fumbles, and 39 sacks. Ray Lewis had 31, 19, and 41.5. Urlacher had 22, 11, and 41.5. Seau had 18, 11, and 56.5. And Derek Brooks had 25, 24, and 13.5. I think you get the idea. In all of the major statistical categories for linebackers, London Fletcher is right there with the best players of his era, the last 4 linebackers to make the Hall of Fame. Now don't get me wrong, London Fletcher was really good, but he never stood out as much as his counterparts did. Ray Lewis was a monster in his first 9 NFL seasons. He led the league in solo and combined tackles 3 times during that span, while also recording 20 interceptions and 22 sacks. Brian Urlacher only played in 182 games over 13 seasons, and he recorded a whopping 41.5 sacks and 22 interceptions. Junior Seau averaged 105.9 solo tackles per season from 1991 through 2000, which is pretty crazy. But London Fletcher was right behind these guys, and if he hadn't come into the league as a nobody, if he'd come out as a Division I standout, or if he hadn't spent most of his career playing for Buffalo and Washington, who were absolutely awful, London Fletcher would have been way more recognized. Fortunately, London Fletcher's status among the gatekeepers of football history appears to be growing. In January of 2019, it was announced that Fletcher will be inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame. He'll be a part of a class featuring 13 players and 2 coaches, including former NFL stars like Joe Thomas, Troy Polamalu, Torrey Holt, and Patrick Willis. That's some pretty good company. Could Fletcher's reputation grow even more? In 2019, he'll be eligible for the Pro Football Hall of Fame for the first time. Is it possible the most underrated linebacker of all time could get some votes for the Hall? Stay tuned.